Hear me? Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm delighted to introduce our Constitution Day event for 2024. This is very interesting for me because, as I think I probably mentioned to some of you, I'm on my way to becoming an American citizen. In fact, I have my interview on Monday, so wish me well. I have to do a test. I have to answer questions about how many amendments does the Constitution have and that kind of thing. So Constitution Day, very important for me because I have been educating myself about the Constitution a little bit, and this is, in theory, the purpose of Constitution Day is for people to take some time to get to know the Constitution and its importance for American history and society and politics. It's also Citizenship Day, which I didn't know until I started doing some quick Googling for this. So also important for us soon-to-be citizens. And so this year, I'm very pleased to have with us David Stasavage, who was, until recently, the Dean of Social Sciences at NYU and is now a professor at NYU's Department of Politics. He is the author, most recently, of The Decline and Rise of Democracy, which is what his talk today will be based on, as well as a series of other books, including with Ken Shivey, Taxing the Rich, A History of Fiscal Fairness in the United States and Europe, and States of Credit, Size, Power, and Development of European Polities. So the decline and rise of democracy discusses two different kinds of democracy, which Professor Stasavage calls early democracy, in which a ruler governs together with an assembly of people who are independent of that ruler. And this can be distinguished from a bureaucracy in which a ruler is supported by people who are dependent on them. In modern democracy, on the other hand, representatives are elected periodically, and they coexist with a state bureaucracy which manages the day-to-day affairs of the government. David argues that the timing of the development of a bureaucracy is a crucial part of understanding why some states are modern democracies and maintain strong democratic norms, while others are not democratic or are so in name only. Luckily for us all, there is much more to the book than I can possibly say here, and let us all welcome David to give us many, many more details.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here on Constitution Day. We're going to get to the debates around the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, as would seem appropriate for today, towards the latter part of the talk. But what I'd like to do is start off early with the beginning and think about how democracy itself began. And when we think about how democracy began, if I can get my pointer to work, we see a traditional story, which is commonly taught, was commonly taught, certainly the way I learned things in school, that democracy at its start was something that was invented in one place at one time, classical Greece. And the Greeks gave us this term, demokratia, which just means that the demos, the people, have power, kratos. And so it was very interesting, very expansive definition of what it means to be a democracy. It didn't refer to specific institutions. And when you think about the evolution of democracy, people sometimes describe it almost as if there's sort of a torch being passed from one civilization to the next, not the NYU torch, but a torch. And they might think next about medieval Renaissance Italian city-states, which had forms of governance that were collective, sometimes broader participation, sometimes less so, but maybe a further step on the way to democracy. And then we think further, of course, of the Atlantic revolutions of the 18th century in France and prior to that in the United States as being the way in which democracy evolved. Well, what I want to suggest or ask you is this question: did democracy really only originate in one place? And the answer, my answer to that, which some people agree with, some people do not, is that no, it was not invented at one place. And one way to illustrate this is that if we think about what happened when Europeans first started after 1500 going out and conquering other societies, some of these societies that they encountered tended to have fairly democratic procedures. And Europeans realized this and remarked about it. So we can talk about, for example, democracy among a group that called themselves the Wendat. We called them the Huron, that were located in the southern part of present-day Ontario. And there was a visitors, French Jesuit visitors, who went among the Huron who were trying to convert them, but being good Jesuits, they spent a lot of time trying to learn about Huron politics and society, and they made some observations that governance was very collective, it was very democratic, and surprisingly, that unlike in Europe at the time, women had some role in politics as well. And so this is one illustration from as someone referring to the Central Council of the Huron Confederation, that their Central Council is like the Estates General of the country. The Estates General, of course, was France's representative assembly, that this was from the mid-17th century that a French Jesuit chronicler was writing. The Estates General in France existed in theory, but hadn't met for some 40 years at that time. So it's interesting to say that they would remark that about these people. We can draw a similar example from the Mesoamerican Republic of Tlaxcala in present-day Mexico. When Hernan Cortez first went on his way to route to conquest of the Aztecs, he remarked that this one independent republic, which managed to survive independently from the Aztecs and abutted on the Aztec Empire, had a very particular form of governance, which he wrote back to the King of Spain about, and this. He said, it has a form of government that's almost like that of Venice or Genoa or Pisa. These were all city-states in Europe, because there is no one supreme ruler. In fact, it was collective. The Tlaxcalans governed themselves in a council of about something like 150 people who were selected and deselected. It was, people have argued, a somewhat democratic form of governance. So all this should push in the direction of saying that some societies invented collective rule, even though they hadn't read Aristotle, even though it wasn't the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, gave us the language for thinking about democracy and the word for it and the language that we still use today. But I think we should acknowledge that some of these other societies also did this. And so, in fact, early democracy was quite widespread. It wasn't a unique form of rule, but it was characterized by attendance at a council or an assembly. It existed, as Justin was saying, in lieu of a bureaucratic state. And the strength of early democracy was its participatory element. Participation was direct and intensive. The weakness was that because it was direct and intensive, it was most likely to be applied in a sustained way in small-scale, face-to-face settings. So not a setting of a much larger state that would emerge over time. And so that's why the book is called not Rise and Decline, but Decline and Rise of Democracy, because this early form of democracy existed for some time, but then it generally declined as societies got larger. Now, I don't want to suggest by any means that early democracy was universal in early societies, because there was an alternative. And the alternative, to which Justin has already referred, was to have autocratic rule. Autocratic alternatives to democracy involve some rule by one person who bureaucracy and through a standing army. It required less consent. Paradoxically, autocracies among early societies often had more advanced technologies in terms of understanding writing, in terms of management, in terms of understanding nature, than did some of the early democracies. It's not the way we tend to think of things today, where we tend to think of democracies as being more advanced. And this is a picture of King Shulgi of Ur, who ruled as an autocrat, had a very sophisticated government apparatus in Mesopotamia towards the end of the third millennium before the Common Era. Okay, so that's the early democracy part that I wanted to talk about. Now let's think about what modern democracy is. Modern democracy works in a fundamentally different way. It's characterized by the selection of representatives who we elect through universal adult suffrage. Voters can only control representatives via the ballot box. We cannot issue them mandates or instructions. All that we can do is say, if we elect you, if we don't like what you did, we cannot re-elect you next time around. Daily governance happens through these representatives and through a state bureaucracy. It's very different in the case of early democracy where you didn't have that. And there's no longer, as was often the case in early democracy, people could opt out of this collective decisions. If they didn't like it, they could just sort of, as it were, take their marbles and go home, to use an expression from some time ago. That's no longer possible today. So the strength of modern democracy is that it has very, very broad participation, all adults, but it also risks being a form of participation that is not very deep, to the extent that people want something more than simply voting every few years. To members of early democracies, that would have seemed like a very odd system indeed. They would have seen it as not fundamentally that democratic, because early democracy involved intensive participation as frequently as even on a daily basis. That's not the case today for the most part, and we'll talk about that. So how did modern democracy emerge? It emerged slowly over the centuries in medieval Europe as a result of assemblies and parliaments in a number of states. It evolved in particular because of the English model. This is a picture of the model parliament, as it's called, of 1295, called the model parliament because it sort of set the rules for parliaments after that for many centuries. And representation at this time came from a new development. Initially, parliaments had only people who represented themselves. They had knights and they had bishops, and they might have other people, but all who represented themselves. And so the question emerged in the 13th century, how do you do it if you have a city, and this is maybe a powerful city, and as a king you'd like to collect taxes from them, say, and they would like to gain representation in your parliament. To us today, that seems like an obvious thing. I mean, if you were the inhabitants of a town, you would elect a representative, and that representative would attend the parliament. From the point of view of the 13th century, this whole idea of how representation could actually work needed to be invented. And so they came up with this concept that a city was a fictitious person. So a city was like a person, and it had the same rights as a person, and it had the same rights to send someone to an assembly. Again, this seems obvious to us today, but it was not obvious to thinkers of the 13th century. And then England led the way with disappearance of mandates. In early democracy, it was common for people to be bound by instructions. Here with England, with the English case after the 14th century, you could no longer bind your representatives with mandates or instructions telling them exactly what to do. So, moving forward now, how has modern democracy spread so widely? Well, one reason I think, obviously it's spread because the British and other European powers conquered the rest of the globe, and other peoples ended up having democratic institutions imposed or they adopted them. But especially today, I want to emphasize this idea that democracy has become something of a universal aspiration. And if you look at this graph, this is a measure, using one measure. Political scientists have various ways, some better, some worse, of asking whether a country is a democracy or not. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. And this is a graph showing the percentage of the world population that was living under democracy from just after 1815 to about 2016, these data go up to. And you can see that initially in the 19th century, very few people were living in democracy. Well, that's because most of the world had been conquered by Europeans, right? So these peoples may have had earlier forms of democracy that got snuffed out. Then there was a general increase in the extent of democracy over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mainly due to developments in Europe and North America. A big increase right after the end of the Second World War, especially with the independence of India. And then a third wave after the end of the Cold War in 1989. Since then, there's been some backsliding, as some political scientists called it. Some countries have become less democratic. So if we were carrying this data through to 2020-24, the line would probably dip a little bit. We'd still have something like half of the citizens of the globe living under democracy. Now, what does that say? That seems quite like an interesting development, and it's paralleled by what I think is an equally interesting development, that today, everybody says they're a democracy. Well, not literally everybody, but many, many countries will say they're a democracy, even if by contemporary Western standards, we may not think that they are. And so this is a document, a quote from a document published by the Public Information Office of the Chinese Communist Party in 2021. This was in response to President Biden in early 2021 had his democracy summit where people from various countries got together. And in this document, which is a very interesting read, it is stated democracy is a common value of humanity and an ideal that has always been cherished by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. So that's an example that I find quite interesting, and you can point to elsewhere, other states that we think of maybe not being democratic by Western standards that nonetheless like to use the idea of democracy. I think that means it's become something of an almost universal ideal, not completely universal, but that it has to mean something. It has to mean something about the appeal of the idea of the democracy, the appeal of giving the people power and having the people rule themselves. So if that's the case, we might want to ask, what are we so worried about? What are we so worried about today and elsewhere with regard to threats to democracy? And I think the reason for this is that the aspiration of democracy may be near universal today, but the institutions of modern democracy sometimes fail to deliver. As I already said, I just want to repeat this because I think it's a critical element. In modern democracy, most people vote, and that's about the only way they participate politically. And they might not be satisfied with that. They might prefer a system where there was more opportunity for participation. So participation is very broad, but risks not being very deep. There's also the question of whether the people can actually rule. Are we ruling as a people today or not? Some people say yes, some people say no, because on a day-to-day basis, certainly decisions are made by people that we have elected and bureaucrats they have appointed, but we as a people are not involved in daily governance. And so this has to involve a question of whether it means that the people truly rule or not. Let's move then to talking about the establishment of democracy in the American colonies and moving forward to the founding. And when European settlers first came to America, they faced an environment a lot like in the Eastern Seaboard, the Native American groups that had often had democratic forms of governance themselves. There was a very high ratio of land to labor with possibility of exit. So what happened was people could do what they wanted. People who were running the colonies, who set them up, said, we'd like to attract people. They often said explicitly, we're going to give you the vote in order to attract you to come settle from England. And so people had a lot of leverage. There was nothing resembling a bureaucratic state. And this led to a form of governance where you had these dispersed communities. Think of the New England towns and the New England town meetings, where you had a form of democracy that was quite intensive, and there was very broad participation, and it was very decentralized. And that's one of the features of our democratic system up until today, is that it's quite decentralized compared to a lot of what you would find in a lot of other large democracies, such as England or France, to take two examples. And what happened is that because there was this consensual form of governance in the colonies, it wasn't really till after the Constitution that we got anything resembling a federal bureaucracy emerging. So early colonial leaders lacked a bureaucracy that they could use to make governance a top-down affair, to sort of order people to do something and enforce that. They had no real means of coercion. What happened instead is that they needed to govern jointly with assemblies of citizens, assemblies that would be at the level of individual towns, and then assemblies that would be at the level of individual colonies. And it was only after a federal legislature was created that the bureaucracy slowly emerged. And as Justin was hinting, I think this sequencing element is absolutely critical. It was important that we had collective governance deeply anchored before we got the arrival of a state bureaucracy. If you think of some other countries, they had the inverse sequence where they had a very strong bureaucratic state first before notions and practices of collective governance became anchored. And in that situation, it's a lot harder to transition to democracy, I think. So that's something that's critical to the development of American bureaucracy, is that we find that we have a bureaucracy today because when you have collective governance first via colonial assemblies and then a federal legislature and state legislatures, the people can help govern the bureaucracy, ideally, together, rather than the bureaucracy just obeying the whim of one person, as would be the case in an autocracy. So as we discuss that development, I do want to talk about three risks for American democracy, three potential risks. And then I'm going to segue into the debates at the time of the American founding and what happened in the early republic, because I think the developments are quite instructive for thinking about where we are today in the United States. So one fear people have today is that someone might use the bureaucratic state and our military and whatever coercive forces we have to take over on their own. I think the nature of our founding makes that less likely as a risk, precisely because, as I was saying, American democracy arose in a very decentralized way with individual towns, individual colonies, all having prerogatives. And even though we have a strong federal government today, much of that decentralized pattern is still there. And so, to my mind, that decentralized pattern, which is, again, so different from some other democracies, is something that would guard against this development. I think there are two much more present risks. One is that people choose to opt out of the democratic process, and I'm going to give some early explicit examples of opting out in just a minute. And then the second is that people will feel divided and disconnected, and therefore distrustful of their government. And certainly we are in an era where levels of trust in government are at an all-time low or a near all-time low, and have been for some time. It's not just the last 4 years, the last 8 years, it's been some number of decades that levels of trust in the federal government in Washington have been very low, if you look at the surveys from Pew in particular. So let's go back now to the case of the founding, to the early republic and the Constitution debates, as it is Constitution Day. And let's think about what opting out meant back in the day. In 1786, an event that's come to be called Shays' Rebellion took place. That's a picture of Daniel Shays. Shays was someone from Massachusetts who led a revolt of people who were upset about indebtedness. Farmers were heavily indebted at this time for various reasons, and laws at this time were not very favorable to debtors at all. We didn't have anything like modern bankruptcy proceedings or ways to reduce your debt. And so it seemed like a worthy cause, but Shays and his associates chose not to use the electoral route of trying to elect someone new who would be more favorable to debtors. They instead tried an armed rebellion, which didn't really work out. But when this happened, this led many of the people who we would call the founders, who didn't think of themselves as the founders yet in 1786, to be quite worried indeed, because they thought, how can our new system work if people are going to just choose to opt out of the electoral process like this and seek change through other means? The second event that happened beginning in 1791 and really reached a climax in 1794 was the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was triggered by a tax that the federal government levied on whiskey, not surprisingly, and it upset farmers in Western Pennsylvania because they had been using their crops and turning them into whiskey because it was easier to transport whiskey to Eastern markets than it was grain, because the grain itself was a lot bulkier. And so a number of them rebelled against this. There was an armed rebellion that was eventually put down by a militia, federalized militia, led by none other than George Washington. And among the Whiskey Rebellion participants, the people were most angry at none other than Alexander Hamilton, right? Because Hamilton was the one who had proposed this tax and implemented it in the first place. And this is not a mistake. To this day, I don't know, there was an interesting article about this in the New York Times, I think maybe 2 years ago, or at least a year ago. To this day, apparently, there are some distilleries in Western Pennsylvania where they hang Alexander Hamilton's portrait upside down in recognition, memory of the Whiskey Rebellion. So to sum this up then, there was a great deal of fear as a result of things like this, that this new republic wasn't going to work very well if people were going to just take matters into their own hands and rebel. So what could you do apart from just using armed force to try to suppress rebellions like this? Well, one response was that some people among the founders got very excited about the idea of common school funds, funding public education. So beginning with Connecticut in 1795, many US states created common school funds. School financing went hand in hand with a curriculum that emphasized civic duty, and it was thought, hoped, or prayed that an emphasis on civic duty, on common schooling, would somehow persuade people to become more democratic and to use the electoral system to effect change rather than to trying to opt out of it and to use violence. And this is a picture of a fascinating document. You can find it pretty easily online. If not, send me an email. I will tell you where you can find it. It's something called the Federal Catechism by Noah Webster. Noah Webster was famous for his early speller that millions of American school children would end up using. And in some editions, early editions of his speller, he included this Federal Catechism, which is really quite a brilliant and interesting discussion in about 15 pages of the new system that was implemented as a result of the Constitution, and what he explained was thought was good about it. And so it's interesting that so many people were exposed to this document, and it might have changed their attitudes. I mean, we do know, we have data showing that rates of voter turnout tended to increase in areas where people were exposed to this sort of curriculum. Although the thing about civic education is it takes a long time, because if you're learning this as an 11-year-old, you're not going to reach a voting age for some time. And just in case anybody wonders why it's called catechism with a Z, Webster is the man who is responsible for the fact that, among other things, we spell color in this country C-O-L-O-R instead of with a U, because he was convinced that there should be American spellings for words, not that we pronounce the word that differently. And he had some ideas. Catechism, of course, has an S to this day. I think he tried to get it with a Z, and then he eventually gave up. And later editions of this document have an S instead of a Z, just in case you're wondering. So that's one response. And one response we might want to think about today is, well, gee, what has happened to civic education? It seems like it's been de-emphasized of late. There are prominent people such as Daniel Allen who have been advocating for new forms of civic education. The second way in which something was done in the early republic to strengthen our democracy relates to the problem of scale. So I want to lay that out first. We know, thinking back to early democracy, that early democracy was generally a face-to-face operation that existed at small scale, people talking face-to-face to each other. Modern democracy is sometimes said to be an adaptation to scale. We have representatives because there's no way in which all of us could get together and make decisions. So we have a representative, we send them to Washington. In a few years, we'll decide whether to re-elect them or not. So it's a nice adaptation, but there are questions about how successful it is in this regard. And there were questions at the time of the founding about how successful it would be. If you go back to the debate over the ratification of the Constitution between the Federalists who favored ratification and the Anti-Federalists who were against, perhaps the most prominent issue on which they differed was whether a large republic was feasible, whether it was feasible to have a republic of the sort that had not existed at this scale before, or whether it would just all fall apart. And there were two different views on this. So famous passage, James Madison thought that actually things would be more stable. Problems of what he called faction, divisiveness would be I should say smaller in a large republic, sorry. And he was responding to an essay by an anti-federalist who went by the pseudonym of Brutus, or the pen name of Brutus. And Brutus had something very interesting to say. What Brutus argued is that the different parts of so extensive a country could not possibly be made acquainted with the conduct of their representatives, that means the representatives in the federal government, nor be informed of the reasons upon which measures were founded. The consequence will be that they have no confidence in their legislature, suspect them of ambitious views, be jealous of every measure they adopt, and will not support the laws they pass. Well, doesn't that ring a little bit, sound a little, if I had presented this passage in the 1980s, people would have said, no, that Brutus was wrong, Madison was right, that's, larger is fine. If we think about it today, it has a certain ring to it, right? Like, this is so big, how people are becoming distrustful. Maybe it's something related to scale. Maybe something needs to be done to deal with scale in a large republic. Well, it turned out that after the ratification was voted in and we had the Constitution, a new federal government, there were nonetheless investments that were made to try to deal with the issue of large scale so that people could be better informed. And if in Federalist 10, Madison insisted that a large republic would be less dysfunctional, he didn't really pay much attention to public opinion. By 1791, just a few years after the ratification, he had changed his tune. And he said this: whatever facilitates a general intercourse of sentiments as good roads, domestic commerce, a free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers through the entire body of the people, and representatives going from and returning among every part of them, is equivalent to a contraction of territorial limits and is favorable to liberty where they may be too extensive. So he admitted that, yeah, a large scale could be a problem, but perhaps there were ways of addressing this. And in particular, it's interesting that he emphasized the circulation of newspapers, because that is something that was actually carried out in terms of policy. But more generally, he had this idea of any sort of investments that could be made that would better connect people to government could perhaps help to address this issue of large scale in a democracy, in a modern democracy. So what happened is Congress in 1792 passed this very banal sounding thing called the Postal Service Act of 1792, but it was a banal act with big consequences. So this was an act that subsidized the delivery of a newspaper almost anywhere in the 13 states for 1 penny. And 1 penny then was worth a lot more than a penny is today, but it still wasn't even then a princely sum. And so this was a subsidy as a way so that people could be better informed via newspapers in a way that they would not have been able to be prior to that. Some of the former anti-federalists argued against one proposal, which thankfully didn't go through. Some Federalists wanted to say, let's have a limited number of newspapers that are subsidized. And then the fear was, well, it would be what they called, the anti-federalists called a court gazette. A court gazette would be, the gazette that a king might put out, just telling people what they should know and not have any sort of free, and press that was, the press would be free in theory, because we do have a First Amendment, but if you subsidize one newspaper over the others, then people are more likely to read that, of course. So that did not happen. But what did happen was, this is a graph showing the spike in the number of independent newspapers. This is like sort of, so your New York Times would be 1, Washington Post would be 2, in the American colonies and then the United States from the late 17th century up until, this is the date for the passage of the Postal Service Act of 1792. And you can see how it began to take off before that, but it really took off after that point. And so this is why, when we get to the 1830s, and Alexis de Tocqueville, in his travels that would lead to his famous book, Democracy in America, remarks, there are newspapers everywhere in America, and there is associations, and associations and newspapers go together. It was because of this act. It was because of these explicit investments. It's not something that just happened because it happened. Okay, so let me then conclude with saying a couple general things. So the lesson, I think, from what I've said here tonight, and that what I try to argue in my book, is that democracy is something that comes naturally to humans. It wasn't invented at only one place. It's not like if it dies one place, it's going to go away. It comes naturally, but it's not inevitable, because we also have alternative models of government in terms of autocracy. Democracy at scale, as we practice it today, poses particular challenges, and these need, I think, to be recognized. It's not as if we simply solved this problem by having representative government. It's still, people still feel a need. They want to be informed. They need to be able to be informed in a large country. They need to know what their representatives are doing. Investments maybe are needed periodically to connect citizens to the state, and to government, and to each other. So today, for example, one of the issues, if you think about the press, is the disappearance of the local press. I don't know if anybody, you may have read about that, but it's not just a phenomenon in the United States, it's a big phenomenon in other countries as well. And this is leading to these sort of information deserts where people don't know what's going on in their own community as much. That's a potential problem. So maybe there are investments that need to be made in that regard, just like the founders and those in the early republic thought there were investments that needed to be made with respect to the subsidization of newspapers at the time. And if we don't do this, I think the risk is that we remain a democracy, but we remain a democracy and we become one that people are increasingly unhappy with. And so that is a distinct possibility, that it just evolves towards, our trend towards distrust will only continue. We become even more segmented, and it'll be very hard to get back from that. So that's, I'll conclude on that point, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you to Mr. Evans, Justin, for bringing their professor to talk to us. I'm very curious about, how do you think about the increasing polarization around the world nowadays? It's not even just domestic level in the States, but also like foreign relations. For example, especially China and America recently, the tension, I feel like, has been the highest point since the end of Cold War. Do you think there is anything to do with democracy, and how would the federal government or citizens take responsibility on that?
In terms of polarization domestically, I think there's a pattern where we're seeing in a significant number of countries an increasing division between urban and rural areas. Urban and rural areas have always been different for, for obvious reasons, but becoming more and more a phenomenon of rural sort of hinterland areas becoming more right-wing, and large urban areas becoming more heavily anchored as on the political left. And that, you can go far afield to, say, countries like Turkey, and you see the same phenomenon. So it's not universal, but it's kind of general. So that is one thing that I think that is going on, and it's important to ask what exactly is driving that. On US and China, that's more of sort of a great power relations question that I have less expertise on.
Like, this kind of goes with like the point you were making at the end about democracy being something that comes naturally to people, but like it's not inevitable, because obviously we have different places that have different governments. But since you have talked about how democracy does seem to be something that like humans seem to naturally seek out, do you think it's like likely that more and more like governments as time goes on are going to like develop democracies and become like more like democratic as time goes on? Sorry if that didn't make much sense.
No, it made tremendous sense. I mean, I think it's, if you're favorable to democracy, then I think it depends whether if 50% of the world population is living under democracy today or something like that. Depends whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty type of person, right?
Yeah.
I think from the point of view of after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War in 1989, and US supremacy, there were some people who had overzealous expectations that democracy was the only way and it would become universal. And I think those have turned out to be, not particularly realistic, because there's a lot of reasons that democracy might not work, and there are other models out there where one person rules through a bureaucracy, and that also turns out to be a very stable system.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, with the rise of AI-generated content and misinformation, is it possible to regain the public's trust in the government?
Well, it's interesting that I'm sort of surprised that in the current electoral cycle, we haven't heard already more problems with AI-generated content creating misinformation. And one of the reasons may be for that we've already learned it's easy enough to generate disinformation without having to use AI. With regard to AI, I think there's some interesting discussions happening out there about whether it can be used to, and again, it's very early days, and we have to acknowledge that these large language models often make huge mistakes, disastrous mistakes. They hallucinate. But can you use AI, for example, as a moderator in a discussion? There are people who have actually run experiments and published papers on this about, say, people are talking about gun control and getting people to express their views in a different way. So maybe they won't change their position fundamentally, but they may feel a little bit less polarized.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. So earlier in your presentation, you talked about how the definition of democracy might have not been universal, especially in like earlier civilizations and when the Europeans actually started colonizing. And we saw like later in the presentation that there was like some discussion about how China values democracy and how they, prioritize it. And from a Western perspective, that might not be true, but do you think that there's like a definition of democracy that's applicable to all cultures?
Well, I like the original Greek definition of demokratia, because the people have power, because what's nice about that is that doesn't refer to a specific institutional setup. We tend to think in the West, we tend to think of democracy as meaning election of representatives with political parties that are competing, hopefully in free and fair elections with universal suffrage. That is a system, that is the system we use to try to get to that objective, the people having power. But it's one technology, and there have been other technologies like early democracy that were used in the past. I mean, as you asked, that is very interesting, because in that document from the Public Information Office of the Chinese Communist Party, they do use well, it's an English language document, so they don't use what is used in China by the CCP to refer to democracy, but it's this, Minju, which means people are the masters. So there are other definitions of democracy that are used out there, and the Chinese Communist Party tries to make the argument that they have a whole process democracy with consultations and so on. I'm not sure I'm very convinced by it, but it's interesting that they're saying that.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So I wanted to ask, because earlier you talked about the initial debates that happened over the Constitution and the US government, like what Madison said. And I know that he also talked about enlarging the sphere. And nowadays we have a very simply two-party system. And do you think that is one of the issues that we're facing with when it comes to having an actual democracy in a larger republic, and that, we should expand and have more parties? And like, what are some steps to maybe?
Yeah, because the development of the two-party system, which became very firmly anchored very quickly, is something that the founders totally didn't anticipate. It was just not seen as, and the French revolutionaries didn't anticipate the development of political parties either. And it's kind of curious that they didn't, because if they look to what had happened in England in Parliament in the early 18th century, you got the development of two early parties, the Whigs and the Tories, that were locked in competition with each other, and there was a lot of polarization. I mean, I think the issues today we face, we have faced umpteen issues. We face, we have two parties. We have the vast majority of House districts are completely uncompetitive, so they're going to go one way or the other way, and you know that. So it's all about who's in the primary. There are some states like Alaska that have experimented with having these open primaries so that you try to get away from only, saying, okay, this is a county or this is a district where we what really counts is only the Democratic Party and the others only what counts as the Republican Party. But I don't know how much hope there is on that front, but there should be some thinking about institutional creativity, perhaps.
All right. Going off of the earlier discussion about the definition of democracy, if we're not able to settle down on like a set definition, how are like political scientists able to identify whether a country is a democracy or not?
Yeah, well, one common way is to use the definition, and there's two alternatives. One is to opposite, say a very broad definition of democracy that says, is there freedom of the press? Is there an independent judiciary? Are there elections? And I think that those are all important and good things, but the risk in going that route is to load too much onto the term democracy. So it basically becomes like, everything is good. There's an alternative, which is a more minimalist definition of modern democracy proposed by my esteemed and now retired NYU colleague, Adam Shaworski, which is democracy is a system where there are competitive elections between multiple political parties and where incumbents sometimes lose, right? Because we have a lot of electoral systems out there where incumbents don't lose ever or don't lose for a very long time, and that's because the process is rigged somehow. So, and that's another alternative definition of democracy that I think, in a sense, is a lot more succinct and perhaps useful in a way.
In the current presidential cycle, there's been a lot of discussion about President Biden's inability to connect with likely voters regarding the threat to democracy, the loss to democracy. Why do you think that was such an abstract concept for the electorate this cycle?
It's an interesting question that I don't really know the answer to. I mean, I suspect there's a lot of people the issue, of course, we're facing an election where most minds are made up. And there's an awful lot of people who are greatly convinced by that argument, right? It's just that they've already decided they didn't need any more connecting. It's these undecideds that don't seem to be motivated by that. Speculating, maybe one idea is that people may be less convinced that there's a deep threat going on because they're so distrustful of the system already. They're not convinced of what they're getting. When the Pew survey asked people, does the government do the right thing federal government do the right thing most of the time, and only like 15% of people say yes, that's pretty remarkably low, right? Other countries like in Denmark, 70% of people say yes. In Germany, it's like 50%. So that may be the root of the problem.
Hi, sorry, I had a quick question. Thank you for being here. But my question was, at times it feels like our country is more divided than ever. Do you think democracy is a cause of that effect, or does it even play a role in that? Thanks.
Well, a democracy is a messy process, but there can be deeply divided countries that are not democracies, right? And where people, try to solve things through violence rather than through elections. And so even if we're deeply divided, one of the great things about elections, if they're fair and free, is that it's a way of solving conflict, not solving conflict that everybody's happy afterwards, but it's a way at arriving at an outcome without violence, or hopefully without violence.
Thank you very much for coming. I was just wondering, you talked a lot about how like most voices in this, like most voters are already made up. Like they already know who they're going to vote for. So how do we convince that middle group who's just like, I don't like either candidates? Like, how do we get them to make up their mind?
I don't know. Do you have any political consultants coming in the semester to? Yeah.
We'll have some courses on that in the spring.
The arguments. There are a lot of people that are, unhappy about the fact that inflation, and particularly grocery prices, rose so much. There are people that are worried about them. People are unhappy about all kinds of things. I think the middle of the road people. I'm not a political consultant. I don't run political campaigns. Someone like that would know a lot more what could be said. And there, I think the problem is that you have 5 different political campaign operators in here, and they'd say 5 different things. If someone knew truly how to connect, it would have already been done.
Hi. In your opinion, is the Electoral College a democratic system?
It's an odd system, right? It's a relic. I mean, no one else has a system like that today. I think this was something that was come up with. You have to remember at the founding, they had a few weeks in Philadelphia. It was the summer. It was very hot. And they didn't have much time, and they were trying to do something that hadn't been done before. And so the mere thought of it's not like there was a model out there for other republics about having some senior person was elected or not. It didn't really exist. You had the British model where you had elections of members of parliament, and then the head of the largest party became the prime minister, but there was not a direct election of the prime minister. And so they came up with this as an idea, and there were various compromises that were made. Obviously, small states were worried about having an underrepresentation, and at the time, because everybody got 2 members of the Senate, that led to less, well, actually overrepresentation for small states. So I see it as something that was, come up with at the time as a means of trying something out for the first time, and that for one reason or another, it is stuck around, and so we do get these. The rest of the world looks at us, and it's very odd when we have everybody else votes by popular vote, and then we can have someone win the popular vote and not win the presidency. So.
Hi. So as for different reasons, like technology evolving and different things, people moving between the states more and even countries more, do you think that affects how effective connecting citizens to the state would be as a solution to moving towards a more efficient and happy democracy?
Well, and I think it's having people that are connected in ways that connections between, say, red and blue in the US context, rather than, so it's probably less about saying, I think there's a lot of people in New York City where I live and teach who are very connected in certain ways, but they're not connected with people people in other areas of the country where people think very differently about their politics. And I think things used to be different in that regard. If you think of in the Cold War era, it was very common, at least in the 50s and the 60s, for many men to, this before Vietnam, to join the military for a period, and you would get assigned to a unit with people from all over the United States. So you would see people from different, walks of life, as it were. And I'm not sure that we have the same sort of institutional mechanisms to lead to that, interaction anymore.
Thank you for being here. My question is, as part of your definition of democracy, you said that part of it is that incumbents, they come and go, they win and lose, right? But at least here in America, when it comes to like House primaries, like you said, we can see like incumbents who like don't lose for like 20 years sometimes, right? So in your opinion, is this still like a true democracy? Even does that still fit that definition, or?
Well, I should have said that that's a definition of democracy that is applied to presidential elections. It's not something that would be applied to legislative elections, because, and certainly, Congress is a little bit haphazard these days, but for a long time, it was actually very useful to have a representative who had been in there for a long time, because they would have, power on a committee, they would have position, they would have influence. And so just in terms of delivering the goods to your area, they could do that much better than with someone who was newly elected. So I see that as a different phenomenon.
Yeah. Good evening. Thanks for putting this together. My question is, I don't want to. This the song is already beating up on America. I live here as well, but I'm curious if you have any other country around the world that we can perhaps look at to kind of see, how democracy really works. If we're disenchanted with the way it works here. Is there a particular country that has a democratic model that we could give some thought to in our own private discussion, our own thought exploration? Thank you.
You know, I think there are not nearly enough studies comparing the US and Canada, our neighbors to the north, right? Because Canadian democracy, it's a different, and it's hard because it's an entirely different society in so many ways, but they do have, and they do, I mean, they have issues, but their issues sort of look very small compared to our issues, right? So it's interesting to think about why that's the case. I don't have an answer for you, but yes, there are countries we can look at.
Hello, thank you for, sorry. Yeah, thank you for your participation, for your presentation. I have 3 questions. Would that be okay with you, sir?
Well, there's someone else to your left who's waiting, so maybe you could go with one and then we'll see.
Okay, yes. So since we're already discussing this broader theme, how do you think smaller communities can be represented in a large democracy? Because we have situations, well, obviously, if we always go by majority vote, those smaller groups and their concerns will always be overlooked.
Well, one of the possibilities is devolves. We do a lot of devolution of things to individual communities in the United States, like local school boards kind of decide a lot about education, and so that's one way to not have every decision made at the top level. But there are alternative ways, perhaps, to think about how smaller communities can have options. They used to have issues where small communities could petition Congress, and there'd be some sort of a need to have it read and perhaps a response. And so there might be ways of participation that go beyond simple voting in elections.
Sorry. That actually goes straight into the question that I had. I was going to ask what place non-electoral politics should have in a healthy democracy, because obviously our nation was founded on non-electoral politics. I mean, we had a revolution to try to get representation within the English system, or initially, because we weren't, well, it's irrelevant. Sorry, my main question was what kind of non-electoral solutions, apart from voting every 4 years, a healthy democracy should have?
Well, one of the ideas that's getting a lot of play in Europe, and the European Commission just actually came out in favor of this, is to supplement our current system with what are called citizens' assemblies. I don't know if people have heard about these. Citizens' assemblies are groups of citizens, several hundred citizens, selected at random to discuss a topic and learn about it and to make recommendations. And so that's a non-electoral form of participation to the extent anybody pays attention to what the citizens actually say. That could be important. This was used in Iceland some years back to produce a new constitution, and again in Iceland in 2019 to think about amendments to the constitution. The thing about reforms like that is that they tend to work in democracies that are already functioning pretty well. Like, people are less worried about the functioning of Icelandic democracy than American democracy. So it's a nice idea, but there's a question about what would that actually do in the U.S. context? I'm not saying no, but it's something to think about. I don't have a complete answer. There was one right at the very back.
I'm living in a place that is so overwhelmingly controlled by one party that I will spend my entire adult life without a single one of my views represented in national fora. And I find that stunningly undemocratic. And I'm wondering if there's any models out there where the other view, the minority view, is forced to be exposed in a legislature or a forum, so that, and I feel the same way. I mean, there's going to be guys living in some other place where they're completely locked by the other party. and their views will never be demonstrated their entire adult life. This is just insufficient.
And it's a recent development. If you go back several decades, it was much less common to have so many areas that were just locked in completely for one party or another. And it's a deeply ingrained feature of our system at this point, and I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure how to get out of it, because you could think about, well, if we voted by proportional representation, so every voice. What was it? What was it?
Stuff with being tied to geography.
Yeah, so that's why I said proportional representation, right? Because you could say you go for proportional representation, and it's just every vote counts, and it's not, you know, in theory, you could just have, you know, some countries come close to having one constituency, and it's just, you know, the number of votes equals the number of seats in the legislature, and that's it. But realistically, countries change their electoral system very infrequently. So I don't know. I don't, you know, if you ask me what's my likely prediction in the next 50 years that the United States would adopt proportional representation, I'd say pretty close to zero.
So question number 2. What is your reasoning behind the formation, right, of this urban-rural divide, especially more recently, as you said, this was becoming more obvious? How do you think people become either right-wing or left-wing or libertarian or authoritarian economy or conservative liberal, especially when you consider that despite cities generally fall towards, even though one consider it as a whole, they fall to this side where they're more to the left, but at the same time, the majority of conservatives or right-wingers are also urban dwellers.
So I don't have an answer for you, but I think what I could say is that this kind of phenomenon can occur for 2 reasons: a sort of bottom up and a top down. And that is, if the bottom up is if ordinary people in rural versus urban areas just grow apart and grow different for their own reasons. Maybe because they have less interaction with each other or something like that. That could lead to that divide. It is the case, for example, that in terms of residents, surprisingly, Americans are less mobile today than they were several decades ago. So maybe that contributes to that. But the other is a top-down thing. And it's possible, you know, some politicians have sought to accentuate this divide because they think it's a strategy for winning an election, right? So if you go out and you seek to mobilize rural resentment in the United States, Kathleen Kramer, great political scientist, has this book called The Politics of Resentment. She's from Wisconsin, traveled all over the state, and that's a strategy that works, and that's a top-down sort of thing to mobilize these people, and maybe it's coming from both the bottom and the top, but that's the sort of process that is generating this.
Hi. To what extent do you think democracy is used as an excuse for countries' actions, such as interfering with other countries' forms of government? And then how do you think that impacts the level of trust in democracy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been used a lot, and it's been used selectively. And so I think there's a lot of, you know, I think in many cases, the US has intervened in favor of democracy in very good ways, but sometimes it's been quite selective in terms of who it supports and who it doesn't support. And so that tends to generate a fair amount of mistrust of countries that try to promote democracy in that way.
Hi, thank you. How do you think the balance of powers between state and federal governments play into democracy? Are states' rights still valid today, or do you think American democracy has outgrown federalism?
I think they're still very relevant just because we're, again, as I said, it'd be great if we could get this back on because it got a little, yeah, thank you. I think they're very relevant today because there are, again, if you compare us to a country like France, also democracy, things are so much more centralized there. Same with the UK. And so we devolve so much power over decision-making to states and within states to localities, that continues to be a feature of our system. And again, I think it comes back to our initial colonial pattern of settlement, where people were settling in these dispersed communities and they managed their own affairs, and they wanted to manage their own affairs without outside interference.
Should we let Peter ask his third question as our final question for the evening?
Third and final, all right.
I think it's quite fitting that this is the last question since it's kind of loaded. So, what do you think about democracy's tendency in more advanced democracies, for example, to be corrupted by interests of lobbyists or by a deep state? And in democracies that are more recent, right, like more flawed democracies, the issue with populism, with voters galvanizing a badly informed population and pushing something.
All right, that's really two questions. So I'm going to take the first part of it, and you next time will be for populism. I think that this has always been a fear, and you can go back to again to the founding in the United States and find this guy John Taylor of Caroline in 1794. I cite him in the book. Comes out with this statement saying, this system that you've come up with, the Constitution, where people vote every few years, is going to become a mockery because the people will vote every year, every few years. That's the only time it'll be this momentary spasm. And then in between those times, it's the insiders who will work on things and get things done. And so that's the challenge in a large scale modern democracy, is how you avoid that outcome. And that's in part what we've been talking about here tonight.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking David once more for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.